This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, March the 4th, 2024, a new month. First Monday in March, getting closer to spring, but many of the issues surrounding how we should live our lives haven't changed much. Not much new there. It's an increasingly complicated ethical life we have. We had a show a couple of years ago with the Oxford-based philosopher Roman Krznaric on how we should live our lives, and he argued in an interesting book, The Good Ancestor, a radical prescription for long-term thinking, is that we have to think of ourselves as ancestors and leaving the earth and everything else to our ancestors. But it's complicated, and the world we live in is increasingly complex. My guest today, Travis Rieder, is a bioethicist, the author of a new book called Catastrophe Ethics, How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices. He's been giving a lot of thought to the same area that Roman Krznaric has been thinking about. And Rieder's new book, Catastrophe Ethics, is out tomorrow. He teaches at Johns Hopkins, and he's talking to us from Columbia, Maryland, where he lives. Travis, welcome. Congratulations on the new book. Why do you think in the 2020s our ethical lives are more complex, or might I be wrong on that? Are they as complex as they were in the 1920s or the 1820s?
I do think that things are getting more complex in an interesting way. And so one of the things that I argue in the book is that we have a set of problems that have a different structure now. And so that structure is that the problems are so massive and complex that we are trying to deal with them as individuals. We feel some moral responsibility. So take climate change as the paradigm example. I feel like I should use, reusable water bottles. I should get energy efficient appliances, maybe buy an electric car. And yet my individual actions can't make a meaningful difference to the outcome. The outcome is caused by trillions of tons of CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere. So my argument in the book is that this structure of problems, that they are massive and systemic and caused by a global population of 8 billion people, that's really different from the problems we faced in the 1820s or the 1720s, and definitely for all of human history before that.
And what does that mean in terms of how we should and how we do indeed live our lives? For many people, because as you suggested, these problems are so huge, they just throw up their hands and say, well, it doesn't make a difference what I do. So I'm going to drive a gas car. I'm going to fly everywhere. I'm going to eat meat and not worry about things.
Yeah. So I talk about the pull of two different sort of moral forces in our lives. So on the one side, some of us feel the pull of moral purity. And so we feel like we should adopt a sort of purity ethic. And you get this sense when you think, I really should compost. I really should install solar panels. And that purity instinct is to withdraw ourselves from the problematic structure that we're implicated in. So in the case of climate change, it's caused by emissions. So I try not to be an emitter, or at least no more than I have to. But as you say, it's so overwhelming. I mean, everything that we do causes emissions. Just living causes emissions, breathing out CO2, but let alone, I live on the East Coast. I have to travel for work. It's a 40-minute commute into the campus. And so we start to think like, oh, I should change the way I eat. I should change where I live. I should change my job. Maybe I should change, the sort of city or area that I live in. And it gets all the way down to like, what milk should I use? Like almond milk is better than cow milk because it doesn't require animals. But then, I learned that almond milk requires, liters and liters of water just to produce a single nut. And water is a scarce resource as well. So eventually you get to this point where, I think some people just throw up their hands and say, the heck with it. Like, I I can't deal with this. I can't solve these problems. So the opposite pole then is nihilism. It's the idea that, well, what you do doesn't matter.
Yeah,
So
and we've done a show with Wendy Seifert, an Australian philosopher, on nihilism. She had a book out, The Sunny Nihilist, a declaration of the pleasure of pointlessness. What I don't understand, though, Travis, is why is this any different from 200 years ago? Someone, for example, who was morally outraged by slavery. The world is it was just as complex 100 years ago. You had the rise of fascism. Even the environmental issue is complicated. Not everyone would even agree they were on the verge of catastrophe. What's different about, say, objecting to slavery in the America of the 1830s or 40s and worrying about how we live our lives in terms of the environment in the 2020s?
I think it's a great question because part of my view is that when we learn how to think about problems like climate change, it actually helps us to reason about other problems that have been around for quite a while. And so I think you're right. I think a lot of the big structural problems like slavery, where an individual might have thought in the pre-Civil War South, I think slavery is terrible and inhumane and a violation of deep rights, but also like I can't change this system because the government and the society is so much bigger than I am. What I do think is different about today is that we are implicated in so many of these problems in so much of what we do. And so I think there are versions of this that still ring true for a lot of the big problems like slavery in the past, but like all of my actions actively contribute to climate change because I am an emitter. When we're thinking about consumption, right, the food that we eat and the things that we buy, I am consciously contributing to major corporations that might have, slavery in the supply chain somewhere that I don't even know about. And so I think it's that pull of purity in the complexity of this society of 8 billion people connected by trade routes, connected by economics, connected by modern technology. That's the thing that has changed a little bit in the last 100 years or so.
You use this phrase, I am an emitter. I'm not sure if you meant that satirically. Are you arguing against the kind of moral masochism where anytime you go out of your house, you might step on an ant, you might do some damage to something somehow? Are you suggesting that that's rather absurd? I mean, philosophers and moral thinkers over the centuries have confronted the same issues. The Greeks and the Romans dealt with this, didn't they?
I am arguing against what you call a kind of masochism, mostly because I think that sort of purity ethic is unreasonable, it's unsustainable, and it actually is self-defeating. So in a world as complex as today, I think you can't actually be a purist because you have to live your life, and that, like, because of the way societies have been set up, you are going to be implicated in massive harms and massive injustices. So what that means is we need to think about ethics in a way that starts from the acknowledgement that you are going to be implicated in these massive problems and then asks what you should do. But because my starting point is rejecting both purity and nihilism, the one solution that I sort of put off the table is I don't think saying, well, because you can't be a purist, that means that nothing matters. I think the problem of modern day ethics is saying you can't be a purist, but things clearly still matter. It clearly still matters that we're contributing to these harms and injustices. So now what do? You have to find some spot in the middle to sort of land and organize your life.
You use this term, purity ethic. You teach at Johns Hopkins, so you're inside the academy. I don't, but we've done many shows on one kind of intellectual crisis or another within the university. Is the purity ethic, which in my mind at least is a form of intellectual immaturity, is it a particularly problematic feature of not just the contemporary university, but of young Americans, of young people around the world?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my friends in the academy, they do succumb to this more easily than, a lot of folks outside the academy who sort of understand at an intuitive level that they need to find a balance and a way to live their life. Our job is to think and study about these horrible things all the time. And so, especially in my field in ethics and bioethics, practical ethics, there are a lot of folks who embrace, for instance, veganism, which is a kind of purity ethic. And so this is not me trying to convince people not to be vegan, but I do think that it's the same sort of argument as trying to be a net zero emitter in the face of climate change, right? It's one sort of moral response to the problem, and I'm just not at all sure that it's the best one. And then you cannot generalize it. So yes, you can be a vegan and try to withdraw yourself from the animal agricultural system, but you're not going to become a zero emitter, which means that your purity doesn't actually generalize across sort of all of these catastrophe ethics cases. So yeah, I do think there's more inclination among academics to sort of be drawn towards this. And part of my goal in the book is to say, if we acknowledge that it matters how you live, but then we also recognize the difficulty with purity, like, can we still do good work here together?
Is the purity ethic a form of Christianity, a turn away from politics, a turn away from any notion of, shall we say, civic or political virtue, and a turn into the self? This was, of course, a very prominent feature of the shift from the civic republicanism of antiquity to movements like Stoicism and Epicureanism. Is history repeating itself in this sense? So, Travis?
Interesting. You asked, first, is it, religious? Is it sort of Christian? I mean, because of course we've had Puritans, right? So it calls back to this. But the modern day purist, I think, is very often like the radical, atheistic, progressive, academic type. And again, this is like, these are my people. I'm not throwing stones. But I do think that it's a very secular movement now to say, like, you're implicated in some injustice, and part of your job is to find your way out of it. You find out that lithium ion batteries that power our entire lives are largely mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo under conditions akin to modern day slavery. Like, your job is to figure out how to live without rechargeable batteries, despite the fact that I'm on a computer, you're on a computer, we all have phones, etc. So yeah, I'm not sure that it's really that tied to religion anymore, although there are certainly religious ways into that mode.
You bring up the cobalt example from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm sure you're all too familiar with Siddharth Kara's book, Cobalt Red, which is about, at least in his view, how the blood of the Congo powers our lives. It's not the only kind of book of this type out these days. We've had a couple of other guests. It reflects, I guess, a collision of ethics. On the one hand, we all want to drive electric vehicles to save the environment, to free ourselves from the impact of fossil fuels. On the other hand, we're realizing that even to make batteries requires a degree of oppression, of kind of neo-colonialism, perhaps even of slavery, that is profoundly offensive. What does this case, Travis, teach us about catastrophe ethics, about how to balance our ethics, how to live well, but also to live real lives?
Yeah, so I give lots of props to Siddharth Kara in my book because I think the Cobalt example is so important and so rich for exactly this reason. I so I've been a long time advocate for electric cars, and part of the reason is not that I think they're going to solve all of our problems, but because every model, every climate model that shows us, not entering into just dire catastrophic straits for with our future for the climate, every one of them assumes a massive transition to away from internal combustion engines. Like, that's just one of the required components. And so my family, my partner and I both have electric cars. I was an early adopter even when the tech wasn't that great. And I talk about it a lot to people as one of these things that we need to sort of opt into as a sort of movement. And then, yeah, books like Cars comes out and says, we need to know, we need to be cognizant of where this is coming from. As the subtitle says, that the blood of the Congo powers our lives in this movement. So yeah, here's a really good example of where your purity ethic might actually pull you to spend a lot of extra money on an electric car once you are at a stage in your life where that's possible. It might even be hard, it might be a stretch, but you're like, I should not contribute, I should not participate in the internal combustion technology anymore. And then you find out that these batteries, over 70% of them are using cobalt from the Congo, and that these are the conditions, and you don't know whether the car that you're buying has that. And so now your purity is no longer possible. You either risk participating in slavery or you participate in this old damaging technology. And so obviously I said my family is an electric car family, so I've made a decision there. But part of what you have to learn from that is that we need to develop moral responses that are more than just withdrawing participation. There has to be another way to signal to the world that there's something wrong here and that I want to be part of solving it, without just saying, I'm out, I'm going to keep my own hands clean.
You use this term, I hadn't heard this term before, electric car family. So does that imply that there are gas car families too? And are you suggesting there's a moral division between the two?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's actually a clear moral division because, for instance, right now, electric car technology is still very expensive. And so one of the things that I don't think that you should do is hold up as a moral requirement something that only the elite can opt into. So I think that's a hugely regressive morality. So yeah, so I definitely don't think it's like gas car families are all, morally problematic. But yeah, we're enthusiastic about the technology. When we bought our new house, we installed the home charger so that like this could be our way of lives now, and we just don't have to go to gas stations.
Isn't this a form, I mean, maybe not of you, but of some people, of virtue signaling, of showing off one's goodness, which is incredibly annoying?
It's incredibly annoying, and it's part of what's troubling about the embrace of a purity ethic. So I mean, the virtue signaling part, some of that is like, well, we can't know whether somebody's really into it or whether they're just virtue signaling. But some of the arguments that I talk about in the book are that, philosophers really worry about, moral philosophers worry about, look, my individual contributions don't make a difference anyway. So sure, Travis, feel good about yourself for buying an electric car. But if you drive a Hummer all day, every day, the environment still wouldn't notice. Like, it's insensitive. The scale is insensitive to your individual choice. And so that's part of the problem. It's just that the scale and the complexity are too great. But there's this other part of the problem, which is that when we focus on ourselves, when we focus on our individual action, we might say, oh, thank goodness we solved that problem. I don't have to worry about climate change anymore. And so it's not just virtue signaling, which might just make you kind of an arrogant jerk. You can be like wholly sincere about, oh, I want to be an electric car family. And it's still a problem if that's where your actions start and stop, because the rest of the world says, look, we have to do more than just you and your little piddly withdrawing from internal combustion.
Yeah, maybe I'm gonna rename this show, Travis. It's an electric car show. In fact, my whole street in San Francisco is full of electric cars, but everyone's horribly rich as well. So there certainly is a connection between inequality also and this virtue signaling in towns like San Francisco. It's a fascinating issue. We're talking with Travis Rieder, the author of Catastrophe Ethics: How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices. If you want to choose well in terms of what you read, I would strongly suggest having a look at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Excellent new publication, full of fascinating new stuff. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Travis Rieder to talk more about catastrophe ethics. I particularly want to ask him about whether or not we should have children in our catastrophe age. So don't go away, anyone. Don't have any children in the next 30 seconds.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Travis Rieder from Johns Hopkins University, a bioethicist and the author of a fascinating new book. It's out tomorrow, Catastrophe Ethics: How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices. One of the great choices we make as free human beings in terms of manifesting our agency, Travis, as you know better than I do, is not what car we have, but whether or not to have children. You've written extensively on this, given it a lot of thought. I come across younger people these days who talk about whether or not it's ethically responsible to have children. I have to admit, maybe I'm just an old fart, that I think it's an absurd question. But is it? What's your take on the ethics of having children in our age of global warming?
Well, I certainly don't think it's an absurd question for young people to ask, but I think it's intensely complicated. And so the reason I don't think it's an absurd question, and as you said, I've written on this for many years now. So there's one chapter in the new book, but the subject matter is so deep. And so the reason I don't think it's an absurd question to ask is that creating a new person is the most morally significant act that most of us will do. Not all of us. Some people will have huge impact on the world and can do lots of other things. But most of us average folks, when you create a new person, what you do is you create an entire new being who will experience joy and pleasure and probably suffering and disaster and tragedy. They're eventually going to die, so they're definitely going to experience that. They're going to be sick at different points in their life. And so there are all of these reasons to worry about, like, what's going to happen to them. Those reasons have always existed. And then what's gotten, more uptake in recent decades is this question of, well, I shouldn't worry about only what the world is going to do to my kid, which is coming to life more and more as we worry about these different disasters on the horizon. But now I also wonder about whether my kid is going to contribute to catastrophes in the world. And so this gets to a question with a very terrible name that people don't like to talk about, but the question of overpopulation. So if the world has too many people on it or too many people using too many resources, should I make another one, right? All of that seems like a totally legitimate set of questions for young people to be asking.
Although this is not a new subject, Thomas Malthus wrote extensively, actually, in the 19th century, and he was wrong. How can we be sure whether we're right or wrong on this? We may invent technology in the next 10 or 50 years that will solve all these environmental problems.
Totally, but we can't be sure about anything, right? The only thing that we can do is try to make the best decisions given the set of facts and the data that we have. And so, yeah, Malthus made predictions that were wrong. Much more recently, we had a sort of like neo-Malthusian movement at the end of the 20th century with the population bomb, and there were predictions made there that were wrong. And so, yeah, like, we certainly don't know what the future holds, but we have data, right? We have modeling, and the modeling tells us that we're using far more resources than our Earth can replenish every year. And so, sure, like, I hope we invent new technology is going to help us, because if we don't, we're just heading off a cliff. But also, in the meantime, we might just worry about, like, could we change the basic structure of the problem so that there weren't so many people needing so many resources. So you're absolutely right. The question is not new, but it's still very real. And so when young people say, I'm wondering about whether I should have a kid in the era of climate change or in the era of like renewed nuclear threat, which of course we've lived through that before. I'm like, yeah, that's a totally legitimate thing.
Well, it may be using the nuclear example. I take the point on the environment, because if you have a lot of kids, it will put more pressure, use more resources. But when it comes to the threat of nuclear war, it's always a risk. It's a risk to live. It's a risk to have children. They may turn out to be disasters. They may turn out to hate you. What is the role of risk taking in your theory of ethics?
Well, I mean, if you're going to have kids, you have to be a risk taker on all sorts of dimensions. So, spoiler alert, I've got a kid. So yeah, at some point in the not too distant future, she's going to barge through the door downstairs, home from elementary school. So I'm a risk taker in that, I decided to make a kid and hope she likes me and hope she has a good life, hope that I can make her happy and hope that she won't come to regret that I brought her into this world, right? So you have to have some degree of risk. But there is a strain of thought in philosophy that there is a certain level of risk that would be unacceptable. That if you really had confidence that were you to create a person, they would experience a lot of misery and maybe not a lot of opportunity for joy and play and creativity and agency, that at a certain point it might actually be wrong to intentionally bring a child into the world. I actually don't have that view. I don't have the view that it would be wrong, that it would be impermissible, that we have a duty not to do it. But I take it seriously that we should really be thinking carefully about the sort of risk that we open our children up to when we create them.
What's your take, Travis? I'm curious on this, on the effective altruism movement. It's been parodied a lot, of course. Sam Bankman-Fried and even Sam Altman and his involvement with OpenAI. Because you sound like a utilitarian. I mean, what would Dostoevsky say about having children? I mean, by definition, when you have a kid, they're going to suffer. That's what being human is, at least in a Dostoevskian sense. So are you a utilitarian? What's your take on effective altruism?
Yeah, so we don't have to ask what Dostoevsky would say, right? He straight up said, if we were rational, we'd never make kids.
But we're not rational.
Yes, which is how the species continues. I'm definitely not a utilitarian, definitely not an effective altruist. And so what's interesting is that if you dig really deep, but you have to be a bit of a nerd to follow me all the way down here, but if you dig really deep, my moral philosophical grounding is actually a bit anti-effective altruist. We really start from the exact opposite place. And so the effective altruist, the one who comes from the utilitarianism that you're referring to, what they're looking at is they say, morality is largely a question of mathematics. We want to make the world better. We want to improve happiness or pleasure or whatever our metric is. And then we have a bunch of empirical questions about how best to do that. And so the version of long-termism that you talked about, Sam Bankman-Fried and Sam Altman, there's the picture there of Will McCaskill, who just released a book last year on long-termism.
Who teaches at Oxford, right?
Yes, he's one of the Oxford crew. So their version of effective altruism that ties back to utilitarianism is a set of mathematical questions. It's about, if we want to make the most happiness possible, what should we do? And the sort of what I think of as the weird turn into long-termism is that they take the math so seriously that at the end of the day, they say, well, look, the trillions of potential future beings that there could be if we don't screw things up by destroying ourselves with AI or climate change or whatever, their happiness outweighs ours by so much that we can largely discount a lot of the happiness and unhappiness of present populations in order to ensure that we live and survive and thrive into the future. So my moral philosophical foundation is the exact opposite. I don't actually think that mathematics helps very much. And so I have a somewhat snide little argument in the book that when we're trying to do morality, when we're trying to do ethics, we're not doing calculus, right? We're thinking about something else. And so the fact that I give some grounding to these purity considerations, and I argue that a purity ethic isn't reasonable, but the fact that I say, look, it is reasonable to not want to be the one that contributes to these big structural features. And then we have to balance it with being parts of these different movements. And I can talk more in a little bit about, how our interests and desires and preferences play a role in how we structure our lives. All of that is very much about our creative moral agency, which the effective altruist just doesn't care very much about. They're like, look, do the math, make more happiness. That's your job.
But you've written extensively on pain. Your last book was called In Pain. You've written on the bioethics of the opioid overdose. Your TED speech has done very well. Millions of people have watched it. Where is your philosophical home then, if it's not in utilitarianism?
It's a really good question. I direct a master's in bioethics graduate program, and so I train aspiring bioethicists. And one of the things that I teach them at the very beginning is, in my view, you shouldn't find a theoretical home and think that you've solved the big question up here in the sky and then just go around and apply it. You've got a hammer and so everything becomes a nail. That really what we're doing when we're trying to figure out hard, practical, urgent, acute, time-sensitive ethical issues is we're pulling on a lot of tools, and we're pulling tools you've mentioned the Greeks a few times already. We're pulling tools from the ancients. They're combining with all sorts of developments we've made in the past several thousand years. And a lot of this stuff already lives up here. You don't have to be like, a moral philosophy nerd to know it. Like, we use the language of respect and we use the language of dignity. And this stuff has pedigree in philosophy in ways that mean things. And so I don't have a home in the sense that effective altruism often, not all of them, but often calls utilitarianism their sort of theoretical home. I think every problem calls for its own set of tools. And when I talk about opioids and the drug overdose crisis, I'm starting with context, science, epidemiology, public health, and bringing the tools that are necessary. And I do the same thing when it comes to climate science and other catastrophes.
What about the politics of all this? We've done many shows on political theory and ethics. We did one recently with Daniel Chandler, has a new book out about John Rawls and his theory of choice, of the ethics of choice. Some people might argue that everything you're talking about is really political, and your refusal not to sort of place yourself anywhere and claim that you're philosophically homeless is an attempt to simply sidestep politics and political theory, and that there are schools of political thinkers, the left, the right, progressives, Marxists, socialists, even conservatives, for whom these issues come naturally. Where is the politics here? Or are you suggesting, Travis, that politics is itself the wrong way to go?
I think about this in a couple of ways. There's the political theory part, and then there's the politics in the more sort of vulgar sense that we tend to find political homes that have ideologies and that sort of thing. The John Rawls and the Robert Nozick and the sort of grand political theories, I think of them as like utilitarianism and Kantianism and all the other stuff, that they're answering different questions, but they're providing the hammer that you can then take to all the different nails that you see, which I don't think is helpful. And so the way in which they answer different questions is individual moral philosophies like Kantianism versus utilitarianism. They're saying when you have a discrete action and you need to decide what to do, here are the moral theories that can adjudicate that. And political theories tend to take that question up a level and say, your question here isn't what should I do? It's what should we do, where the we is then institutional or structural or governmental. And so John Rawls famously said, the question of justice is the basic question of how to set up society from the
how to choose. I mean, he suggests in politics, choice is core in terms of thinking about a just community.
Yeah. So, at both the high political structural level and at the individual morality level, I do the same thing. I try not to sort of adhere to a single school. Now, the book Catastrophe Ethics, that problem is, I think, problematic precisely because it lives between those two places. So what is it? What is the feature of climate change that makes it so sticky? It's that you can really only solve it with politics. How do you solve a problem that involves trillions of tons of greenhouse gases emitted by 194 countries? You solve that through political engagement and, the game theory, right? And so the individuals aren't in that story at all. And yet individuals have this sense of moral responsibility that I'm participating in a problematic system. So that's why this lives right in between the individual ethics and the political ethics.
But the other argument might be that you're reducing everything to individual ethics. You're refusing to place yourself in a school. You're suggesting that everyone should be, and they can't think as sophisticatedly as you because they're not professional bioethicists or ethicists. But isn't that essential? I mean, aren't making these decisions by definition political, whether it's the environment, inequality, digital rights, privacy, all the issues that worry people, that keep them up, that are associated with potential catastrophe? They're all political, and we have to be political, because if we're not, for better or worse, then everything gets reduced to complete chaos.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the one thing I'm definitely not saying is let's make this an individual problem. No, the starting point is you can't solve climate change with individuals. You solve climate change with legislation, cooperation, international agreements, etc. The question then is, does that mean that as an individual, I'm completely let off the hook? Because here comes the nihilism, nothing that I do matters. And that's where I say no. What you do can still matter morally, even if you can't act as a nation state or as a massive collective. So now here's the other way to think about being political. You could say, well, I as an individual should worry about my individual actions being political actions. So don't worry about buying your electric car. Don't worry about composting. Forget this virtue signaling nonsense. And instead, go out and vote, go out and lobby, phone bank, do the work, march in the streets. That's how you actually get change, because change is brought about by corporations and governments and institutions, and you can call them to task as an individual. I say, fine, great. Those are other ways that you can engage as an individual, but it seems a false choice to say you either focus on composting and electric cars are our ever-present example, or political action as an individual, because your political action as an individual is also going to be this tiny little drop in the bucket, just like your individual action as a consumer. And so you see it all as a set of things that I can do with my tiny little resources to affect this grand problem. And so what should I do? Now, if there are people who think that question gets no grip on me because I don't think anything I do matters, they're in the nihilist camp, they're not going to be interested in my book. But a lot of people do seem to have this angst, like, I want some help thinking through how to live justifiably. I know I'm not going to solve the problem, but are there better and worse ways to live? Then that's who I'm talking to. I want to say, yeah, like, I think if you could compost or throw your waste in the landfill with equal effort, compost, like, obviously. And we shouldn't have to do that every time, so we can develop some heuristics and tools, and that's part of the goal of the book.
Finally, Trevor, it's a very interesting subject, and you're very good-natured in talking about it. What about the rise of authoritarian systems? Maybe not so much Putin or even the Chinese, but the Singapore model, where you have an enlightened or a supposedly enlightened government helping people live ethically without democracy. What's the relationship between our world of tough choices, your arguments in catastrophe ethics, and democracy? Could one argue, and this is, of course, one of the foundations of the shift from civic republicanism to stoicism in the ancient world, that many ethicists are more comfortable living in authoritarian systems?
Wow, I didn't expect that turn at the end. That would be disconcerting if that were true. So I would certainly not want to live in an authoritarian regime. So I just had a meeting this morning with some of my colleagues who work on grant-funded projects on ethics in the response to COVID-19. And we had this really interesting conversation about how important is it that you have democratic buy-in to the sort of response to a massive threat like COVID-19. So in the early days of the pandemic, when we still didn't know very much and everything was very new and very scary, how important is it that you have democratic legitimacy, that society backs you as you make choices from a public health perspective? And my colleagues and I were all sort of agreeing it's very important, even when it's scary, even when it's urgent. And so I don't talk a lot about this in the book, but you've pushed me into admitting something I hadn't really thought about, which is that I do have some homes in philosophy and in ethics. And so two of my homes are, you have to have freedom of agency, so some democratic ability to act, and you have to have freedom of information. So you have to be able to get good facts and do your diligence and actually learn. So I say quickly at the end of the book that we actually have some responsibility to ensure the continued existence of good information, of free sources that are actually just doing their best to get us the information we need to make good judgments. And so, yeah, freedom of information and the freedom of agency that comes with a democracy, those are actually foundation, ground level stuff for doing any of the interesting ethics that